Okay, welcome to this new podcast. My name is Jacob, and I've been dying to do some sort of podcast with my good friend Nate here. Um, we've been co-captains on the basketball team for back in high school, and now we are co-coaches. And we thought it would be great just to do some sort of podcast. We never really planned on anything to do it like past couple of years, but now we decided to do it. So, how are you doing, Nate?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to get this first episode out of the way, and I'm really excited for what the future has in store for this podcast. So, to all you who listen, we will be doing our best to provide good analysis of sports, but we'll see how that goes because most of this is opinionated. So,
Yeah, I think it'll be a fun ride for sure. Okay, so we're gonna start this pod with just a quick recap of what happened in the week of sports. So last Sunday, Giants and Seahawks. The New York Giants pull off a weird and shocking upset as their offense came alive in the third quarter and held off Russ and the Seahawks at the end of the game to take the win, 17-12. It was a typical kind of underdog win. The Giants didn't do too much on offense. The Hawks had more total yards and first downs than them, but Russell Wilson fumbled once. He was sacked 5 times. Giants running back Alfred Morris scores 2 TDs, and he hasn't scored a TD since December 2018. So, Nate, what are your thoughts from this game?
all right. The first thing that stood out to me from this game was the last drive. The Seahawks get the ball back with about 2 minutes left in the game. Russell Wilson has the ball in his hands in what's usually a for sure touchdown drive, and this time they managed to screw that up. He suffers a sack on third down, pushes them to a 4th and 17, and then on fourth down, incomplete pass. And I don't know. I was really shocked with what I saw from Russell Wilson there, a guy who has led many late touchdown drives to win games. It usually feels like a gimme when the ball's in his hands. One thing I do want to mention, though, is that right tackle for the Seattle Seahawks, Brandon Shell, was out. This did affect the game. On the right side, they were getting killed all game. And the Giants' defense, although not great, it hasn't been terrible this year. But it was really interesting for me to see just Russ has really lacked some confidence since week 9 loss in Arizona. Um, he threw a few picks that game. They lost in overtime, and nowadays it just feels like he won't take the same shots down the field as he would earlier in the year. So
Yeah, I don't know. He did look a bit odd this game, but also like that pick he threw to what it was it Chris Carson who dropped it and then bounced off to the Giants DB. That was unlucky. And then yeah, he fumbled once, got sacked a bunch of times. It kind of sucked, but I think and now it's a bit shaky now since the Rams won against the Cards on Sunday, and now it's tied in the NFC West. So heading into the Rams Cards game, the Rams used their first half lead to come out on top against their divisional rivals, as their offense and their defense showed up in a 38-28 win. Jared Goff threw for 351 passing yards, 1 passing and 1 rushing TD, and defensive back Troy Hill gets the pick six in the fourth to seal the game. And now everyone's talking about the stat where the Rams are 33-0, leading after halftime under Sean McVay. What are your thoughts, Nate?
yeah, getting into this game, I do want to mention that Jalen Ramsey really looks like the best cornerback in the league. He was on DeAndre
Yeah,
Hopkins this weekend, and for most of the game, he did a great job on him. I mean, I think Hopkins had 1 TD, and in the first 3 quarters had 33 yards passing. Um, they're a solid team. Kyler Murray has a lot of great potential. He moves his feet better than any quarterback in the league, not named Lamar Jackson. That one is arguable, but it's it's really interesting to me to see Arizona is kind of flailing down the stretch without veteran leadership on the offense. I mean, DeAndre Hopkins has played for a while, but Kyler Murray's still young, and they're in a division with really tough opponents. The Rams have been good all year long. They've suffered some weird losses, but they've had some big wins, like against Tampa Bay, against Seattle. And they're just a tough team. And Jared Goff has played good enough throughout this season to keep them in it. And their
He's gotten
defense
better.
has been
Yeah.
stellar. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think it'll be tough for the Cardinals to actually have any play in the division at this point. I mean,
Yeah,
with the
no.
7th wildcard spot, they could get in there, but yeah, it's a really tough loss for a Cards team who was looking like they would be a factor in the division a couple weeks ago. So
Yeah, and it's also like jumping off your point of veteran leadership there. Larry Fitz wasn't playing cuz he was in the COVID reserve list, and also Kyler Murray, yeah, he got sacked quite a few times too, and it's just a matter of experience in that team cuz you're playing a Rams team who's undefeated after halftime and also went to the Super Bowl. And now since they got off to a rocky start in the start of the season, but now they're doing really well. So I think yeah, it's just tough for the Cardinals for sure, but it'll be interesting to see who finishes out on top on the NFC West. Okay, now on to our last topic from this week in sports, probably the last transaction in the NBA that will be made for a while. John Wall goes to Houston, as well as a first round pick for Russell Westbrook to the Wizards. Nate, how do you feel about that?
I think it was a long time coming. James Harden seems to chase off every good teammate that he has. Dwight Howard, Chris Paul, who was awesome for my OKC Thunder last year, and now Russell Westbrook. It's I don't think it's meaningful for the Wizards. I mean, they might make the playoffs this year because of that trade. I think they will with Beal and Westbrook, but they really have no shot at contention. For the Rockets, I think they were more in it for rebuilding. I After the whole James Harden strip club incident this weekend, I think that they're ready to move on from him nearly if they can find a good trade partner. And I think taking a shot on John Wall as a new building block is pretty reasonable because I think it's been seen that Russell Westbrook can't be a building block for a winning team. And so, yeah, I mean, John Wall's been gone for a couple of years, but he was really good pass first point guard beforehand. And I think that he has a little bit more potential to build around than Russell Westbrook at this point, just because you know what you're going to get with a Westbrook-led team. So
Yeah, it's funny from the Rockets standpoint. The past like 8 years, first of all, they found out Dwight Howard was the problem. They get rid of him. They get Chris Paul, and then they find out he's the problem. Then they get Russ, and now he's the problem. And now you end up with James Harden, and you finally find out like the core problem to your team, just because of how he's just hasn't performed in the playoffs, and now like when you look at it, like sure the Rockets may have lost Russ, and you're getting back a guy who hasn't played in 2 years, who still can't shoot, but he still has amazing athleticism. So it's really interesting to see where that team goes in the West, and then looking at the East, it's also interesting for the Wizards since you have a guy in Russ who actually wants to play. So
yeah, before we move on, I just want to mention big shout out to Christian Wood. He held down the fort for my fantasy team last year, and
oh yeah,
I
for
really
sure.
think he's an underrated player. Like watching him play, he can do a bit of everything, and honestly, I could see John Wall coming back and being pretty good, and him combining with Christian Wood to form a decent young-ish core there to help lead a team eventually. So
Yeah, especially they got a new coach, so
who's the
it's
winner of this trade in your opinion?
I I don't think there's actually a loser, but I think Washington won this more than Houston just because they got Russ, who's ready to play, compared to Wall, who's kind of like coming off an injury, and they
Yeah,
have Bradley Beal, they got Troy Brown Jr., a lot of good young guys. So I think Washington won this more than Houston.
yeah. Westbrook at least can bring a little bit of excitement back to Washington. So
Yeah, yeah. All right. So this week's podcast topic is our 2020-2021 fantasy basketball preview. So, our first kind of topic that we want to talk about is what are some fantasy players who are good for new teams? So, like free agents or guys who got traded to teams. So, Nate, what do you have for that? Which player stands out to you the most?
Well, my first one, he'll probably be a mid-round player this year, but it goes out to Gordon Hayward. I mean, people talk about the Hayward contract as being a bad spend. I think he was paid a little bit too much money, but I think fantasy-wise, like he had his best true shooting percentage last year. He was shooting the best percentage from three that he's ever shot last year. His free throw rate went down a lot last year, but I think that's just a product of what the Celtics had going for them on offense. I really think he's a guy with more playing time who doesn't regress in many categories, but will definitely give you more points, more assists, more rebounds. He's the one thing I like to look out for in fantasy is guys who are smart players. And honestly, I don't think that Gordon Hayward is a type of player who takes bad shots, who makes bad plays. I mean, he will be forced to take more shots than he was last year because really the Hornets are pretty weak on offense. But he's not a guy who will chug up 20 shots a game and go 4 for 20 very often. And I really see his points increasing to about 22, 23. His assist rates being around 5, and probably he had his best rebounding season last season, even out of all the seasons he was an all-star in Utah. And so I think you can count on him for being kind of a 23, 5, and 7 guy with maybe even your occasional triple-double depending on how they play through him. So I think he will be a good mid-round choice. Like if you're looking at a player in the 5th or 6th round, I really do think he'll outperform some of those players. He's the number one option on Charlotte. So
Yeah, I think people forget how important Hayward is to even just last year in the Celtics. Like you watched them play without him in the playoffs in the bubble. Like he was out with some sort of, I think it was an ankle injury or something, and you just see like, man, like once he came back for that Miami series, you're just like, yo, this team's like a different team just because you got another ball handler, you got another playmaker, you got another guy who created his own shot, right? And just missing him in those few games in the playoffs just shows how important he was. And I guess I guess his stardom and his character has been kind of overshadowed by Jason Tatum and Brown and all those guys on the Celtics. So I think you bring up a really good point in saying that Hayward's still the number one option. Sure, he's getting old, but I think he's gotten a lot smarter. He knows the ins and outs of the game. So yeah, I think he'll be a really good option for fantasy because he'll get a lot of touches for sure.
yeah, I mean, last year obviously you don't have the same opportunity with guys like Tatum, Brown, and Kemba on your team. But really, I mean, apart from maybe less dunking, less hard attacks to the rack, like I really saw him as a player who was still nearly as good as he'd ever been. Like he had altered his game to play a little bit more from the mid range and shoot a higher percentage from three. But I think those things cover up for the less dunks and hard drives that he has. And I really think with more usage, he will return to being that player that he was in Utah before he left for Boston. So.
Do you think LaMelo Ball will start over Terry Rozier or other way around?
I think it's a kind of situation, if you look at the Dolphins with Tua, a little bit of a different situation, but I really think they're starting Terry Rozier as almost as like showing respect to him for playing so long. But their starter is LaMelo Ball at some point in the season.
Yeah, because
I
think
no
that
question to me.
that greatly affects Hayward's playmaking in terms of their offense. Because if you start Rozier, I think Hayward's probably your main playmaker beside Devontae Graham. And then when you insert LaMelo in there, I think there will be a tendency for him to just do whatever and not make the smart plays and find Hayward and give him the ball to play make and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Actually, one thing I wanted to add too, like, okay, Charlotte, don't get me wrong, they're not a good team, but they have guys who are willing to shoot. Like, Gordon Hayward won't have to take all the shots because Devontae Graham, as soon as he touches the ball, he wants to throw it at the basket. PJ Washington, he's an okay offensive player, but he shoots the ball. And the thing is, like, if you're Gordon Hayward, you are going to end up with some assists that are from passing it around the perimeter, and Devontae Graham decides that he wants to take a 30-foot three.
yeah.
So I think it's interesting. Like, yeah, there will be a lot of pressure on him offensively, but not quite as much as people think. Like, I don't think he'll be forced to take as many bad shots as people might envision at
And
this point. So
that's a good thing too, just because Hayward's just an aging guy. I think he's probably past his prime. And I think it's good to have this kind of balance where sure you rely a lot on him in terms of how the offense goes, but not everything heavily relied on him just because Graham played a full season who like he probably almost won most improved last year. He can take a lot of shots and give the ball to Rozier and all those guys. So I think it's a good option for Hayward to really fit in with that team. It'll be interesting for sure, just because Melo's there, and kind of the point guard mix up there with Rozier and Graham and stuff like that. So, and any other last thoughts about Hayward?
no, I would just say look for him in rounds 5 to 7 because he'll probably have a better year than other players there.
Yeah. All right. Here's who I have for fantasy players who are good. For new teams. I got Dennis Schroeder for the Lakers. He averaged 19, 4, and 4 last year on the Thunder. He was the second leading highest points per game on that team, and he came off the bench. And he reminds me of Lou Williams. And if we looked at Williams last year and what he did off the bench, sure it was up and down, but when he was hot, he was hot. And I think for Schroeder, it's kind of the same thing, but better, because it doesn't matter if he's going to come off the bench or start for the Lakers. He's going to get his points. He's going to get his assists too, just because Harrell's there, Davis is there, and the only thing I'd be concerned about is Braun in terms of his assist share. But just because LeBron just came off winning a championship, I think Schroeder's going to get a ton of minutes at point guard, because if you look at the Lakers squad, they don't really have any other point guards besides Caruso. And you're not going to play Quinn Cook. You're not going to play Taylor Horton Tucker. I think a lot of the ball handling, a lot of the playmaking is going to fall heavily on Schroeder. And he's such a good option to go to, I think.
Yeah, well, I definitely watched a lot of Dennis Schroeder last year, and I think he is a great player. And like you were bringing up there before, I mean, LeBron at the start of the season, you'll probably see some Kawhi-ish load management, whether that be taking games off or playing 20 to 25 minutes in a game. I really think Schroeder is a good option. Last year, he averaged 4 assists, but that was because he spent most of his time playing with the 3-guard lineup in OKC, which had Chris Paul leading it, and Shai Gilgeous averaging 5 to 6 assists a game. I really think that his playmaking is pretty underrated. He's a good shooter. He can get mid-range threes, and yeah, I agree with you. I didn't think of him before, but I think that his production could see a big boost. I think points will stay around the same. I imagine we'll see 19, 18 points a game. But I think his assist numbers will trend up to 6 or 7 this year. And I think that he is a better defender than he is given credit for. And I think in a Lakers team that's focused on defense, you could also count on a steal or a steal and a half a game. So, yeah, good player.
Yeah, I think your take on the assists thing, I think I totally agree, because, yeah, he was on the Thunder with 3 guards, but now you're on the Lakers squad who's got really no other good point guard if you don't count LeBron as an actual point guard. And when you look at the rest, I'm looking at the rest of their squad. You have Schroeder, Caruso, Quinn Cook, Wesley Matthews, and and so I think this opens a lot of opportunities for Schroeder to go pretty early, or it can be a pretty mid to late round steal in terms of his production. So
Yeah, you could probably get him in the late rounds. I would say you're looking at a solid upside in the late rounds. Mid rounds is a little tough to take someone in the mid rounds who plays with LeBron James and Anthony Davis, but I would say lower rounds is where he should be going this year, which
yeah,
is higher than last year. So
yeah. Okay, so I got a couple more honorable mentions. I'm just gonna just list them off and let me know if you have any thoughts about any of these players. So I got Robert Covington, Montrezl Harrell, Eric Bledsoe, Christian Wood, your favorite player.
yeah, Christian Wood is my favorite player. If anyone didn't get a chance to watch the post Drummond Pistons, they lost almost every game, but he scored like 20 and 10. So if Harden gets traded, he is a mid round pick. If Harden stays there, I don't even know if I'd pick him because Harden takes every shot. So other guys that you listed, Eric Bledsoe, I think it's going to be tough for him to have great production there.
Really?
I think he's a good player, but they have well, obviously they have Lonzo Ball, and that's an experiment that's going to go on throughout the season. I think he is a good player, but he's spent so much time being thought of as a good prospect, and he hasn't performed except for a small stretch in last year. But I think he is really the starting playmaker going forward. I think Bledsoe's value, a lot of his value was stored in being a part of that Bucks offense where everything is drawn to Giannis and you're just playing out of that system. I don't even think I would take him in the draft. Maybe a waiver pickup later in the season, depending on how Lonzo plays. But
I would say this for Bledsoe. His value would depend on how good Lonzo will play. And if Lonzo plays horrible, I think he'll get a lot of touches with the ball. And sure, Ingram is going to get a lot of touches too, but I think in terms of an actual point guard ball handler role, I think if Lonzo just kind of drops off like he did last year, I think Bledsoe will get a lot of touches for sure. So I think it'll be interesting to look into that.
And you remind me of your two other players there as well.
Montrezl Harrell and Robert Covington. Anything to say about those guys?
Montrezl Harrell, I think his production will go down. He's just not as good of a player as his production last year. And Robert Covington, I mean, you love the Blazers, and he's a source of steals. He's a source of around 13 points. His rebounding got a lot better with the Rockets after playing center, so we'll see if that...
He averaged 7 rebounds.
Yeah, we'll see if that continues. I mean, he's a really good player in terms of steals and blocks. He might be the best steals and blocks player this year, combined with Jonathan Isaac out. And yeah, I mean, I think he will be a good producer. Again, another late round guy, but he could be a good producer this year. So.
I think the way I see Covington, and maybe this is because of my Trailblazers bias, because they're my favorite team, but I think that the Blazers get Covington, and they're like, yo, man, this guy is so good. I think we're going to have to play him like 33 to 35 minutes a game. And just because of that, I think he's going to get a lot of usage in terms of getting open corner threes when Dame and CJ get trapped. And he's going to get a bunch of steals and blocks. So I think his usage is going to get a big jump. So that's what I'm going to say about Covington. So
yeah, I think that if you take Covington, you have to know that Nurkic's production is going to fall. So
a little bit.
I guess that's a point for later.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on to rookies, which is this is a very interesting topic because this year's draft was filled with a bunch of very intriguing guys. But to me, I think the only reliable option in fantasy is James Wiseman because he's going to start for the Warriors. He has an NBA ready body, and the Warriors really don't have any rebounding outside of Draymond Green, and they have no rim protection at all. So I think Wiseman is going to get a lot of usage. I think he's going to fit well with the Warriors and in the NBA in general pretty fast. So, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at center guys, at least in the league that we play, double doubles get you extra points. And I mean, if you're looking at centers who have consistent double double production, it's really decreasing, actually. There aren't as many big guys playing big minutes anymore. A lot of guards are going up in rebounding numbers. And you're looking at a team in Golden State who should be playing James Wiseman 30 minutes a game. And James Wiseman is a 7'2" young guy. So, yeah, I mean, between putbacks and rebounds, you're looking at around 10 and 10 a game, which really is, it's kind of the ceiling for this class. I mean, unless you have a big unless you really believe in LaMelo Ball's production, I think you're kind of looking at capping out around a 10 and 10. And so
Yeah.
James Wiseman, he's probably the only rookie that should consistently be chosen in a fantasy draft.
And I think the production he'll get is probably very similar to Clint Capella, where he's just a rim running guy, run up and down the court, get blocks, get rebounds, kick out to open shooters, stuff like that. So
Yeah.
and
yeah,
be a
bringing
lob
up
threat too. So
Yeah, bringing up Clint Capella, I mean, those big guys really thrive on teams who shoot a lot of threes. So if you're looking for rebounds and points, James Wiseman should be he should be giving you around 10 to 12 points and 10 boards. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have Wiseman as your rookie, or did you have someone else?
no, I didn't have Wiseman as my rookie. This one's a little out there, but it's a team who really has no one else to produce. I was looking at Killian Hayes out
Oh.
of France. He's playing for the Detroit Pistons this upcoming year. The Pistons, they have absolutely no one on offense. I mean, Jeremy Grant's a great player. Don't get me started on Jeremy Grant. I love Jeremy
He's
Grant.
probably your second favorite player over Christian Wood. Maybe even the
Yes.
other way around.
I love Jeremy Grant. I think that Denver made a huge mistake not paying him, and
Yeah, no way.
but Jeremy Grant isn't really a off the bounce kind of guy. He's a decent spot up shooter. He can get to the basket, but really that team it's lacking a player who creates off the bounce. And when I look at Killian Hayes, I see a high usage guy who's a pretty good shooter. He shot around 38% in his Euro League this last year. He has a high assist rate as well. He's really sloppy with the ball. He turns the ball over a lot. However, he's just going to have so much opportunity in Detroit. He's going to be their day one starter, announced about a week ago.
Yeah, it was actually
And,
announced. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I see him as a guy who will miss a lot of shots, but the fact that he's taking so many will give you some points, and his assist totals will go up as the season progresses. So I see him as someone who will really struggle out of the gates, but could be the best rookie in this class at the end of this season for fantasy.
That's an interesting take, just because you have Derrick Rose as your backup point guard, who you know is going to get stability on offense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Derrick Rose, he's been good over the years. He was really good last year for Detroit, too. But I just think if you are the Pistons, you are not a team who looks to play Derrick Rose as many minutes as a contending team. I predict
Fair enough, yeah.
if Derrick Rose does well, come the middle of the season, he'll be traded somewhere to play for a championship.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point in terms of him. Just looking at the Pistons lineup, it's like, where do you get the offensive production? Because you have Blake Griffin coming off an injury. Your starting center is Mason Plumlee. You're probably going to start Jeremy Grant, and you got a bunch of young guys in DeLon Wright, Sekou Doumbouya, Sadiq Bey, which is interesting, Josh Jackson, Dazan Musa, LiAngelo Ball. None of these guys really showed any offensive production. So I mean, like the Pistons thing is just really interesting and weird team. So I think your take on Killian Hayes is very interesting in terms of how he can maybe emerge as a really good playmaker and number one option on offense. Not number one,
Yeah,
but I don't know, somewhere
yeah.
there.
I mean, most teams tend to produce one viable fantasy candidate. The Cavs 2 years ago did not. However, I mean, Colin Sexton was not bad this year, and Kevin Love still gave you some production.
Yeah.
But almost every team will give you a reasonable fantasy player, and I can't identify one on the Detroit Pistons other than potentially Killian Hayes. So
Yeah. It'll be interesting for sure. Let me just add this one more kind of bust for the rookies. I think people might be super high on this guy, but in my opinion, I really think he's not gonna. I think people might draft him late round, but I don't think he's gonna do anything. And so this guy is Obi Toppin from the New York Knicks, and and my reasoning is I see him more as like a Miles Bridges kind of guy, where sure he's this Showtime dunker, athletic NBA ready body. He's got all like everything right. And I watch his highlights. He's a beast. But I think just because he's on the organization of the Knicks, just because you have just so many forwards in like Julius Randle, um, Kevin Knox, RJ Barrett, all those guys, I think he's gonna end up like Miles Bridges, where he averages like one highlight dunk a game, but ends up with 3 rebounds, 7 points in like 25 minutes.
yeah, I agree. I think if you watch Obi Toppin's highlights, not a lot of people are going to tell you this because he dunks like crazy, but there are two types of athleticism. There's one type of athleticism where you are the fastest, you jump the highest, and it will always be that way. When I watch Obi Toppin play, I just feel like that athleticism doesn't exactly translate to the NBA because he is explosive in some ways, but he's also a very big guy, a big blocky guy who thrives on dunks right now. But I think you'll see him having a lot of trouble getting to the lane, a lot of trouble on defense, especially. Like he does remind me a lot of Miles Bridges because Miles Bridges' athleticism didn't translate to defense and fast break opportunities as much in the NBA as a lot of people thought it would. So.
Exactly. Like when you watched Miles Bridges last year, he you mostly find him in the corner waiting for an open three, right? You can't really post up the guy either, and same with Toppin because Toppin is only 6'9". Sure, he's strong, but does he really have the fundamental skills to really get buckets in the paint besides putbacks and dunks and stuff like that? And just seeing what Bridges like has underproduced, I think him being the comparison to Obi Toppin is fairly accurate for this year.
Yeah, I agree.
Any other thoughts on any rookies or?
Um, I would say keep your eye on Halliburton. He's in a good spot now with Sacramento, where they have a lead guard in De'Aaron Fox, who's a really good player. But he's a smart player. He makes the right plays. He reminds me a bit of Jason Kidd in the way that he kind of sees the floor, doesn't force anything. So
Yeah.
keep an eye on him for waivers.
Yeah, but he's got a broken jump shot. Have you seen his jump shot?
I have seen his jump shot, and it is pretty broken.
It looks like he just came out of high school. It's like, and his arms are so skinny too. It's he just kind of like heaves it up from his like such a high release point. I don't know. It's so weird.
Yeah, I agree, but still his playmaking is
Yeah.
worthwhile. So we'll see how he
Yeah.
plays in the NBA.
Okay. One more thing about rookies. Anthony Edwards. Do you think is he going to start for the Wolves? And do you think Rubio's going to go to the bench, or are they going to start Rubio and Russell and bring Edwards off the bench? What are your thoughts?
I think you'll be seeing Anthony Edwards playing a bit at the three.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
After the Covington trade, you're looking pretty lean at the three if you're the Timberwolves. There's just not many options there. And I don't know. Anthony Edwards is a guy that I really see becoming an Andrew Wiggins type of player. I mean, the Wolves really went for another guy who doesn't know if he loves basketball,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I don't know what to say about them. I think he could average a lot of points. He won't be a good fantasy asset because of the lack of assists and rebounds. And I don't know. I think that he will start for them. I think he'll probably start at the two and then move to the three once Rubio comes in and they want to play
yeah.
Russell and Edwards. But
I, I think Edwards is really easily replaceable for the Wolves in terms of playing Rubio and Russell more, just because they have those guys to play, and they got guys like Malik Beasley, Josh Okogie, even Jarrett Culver. He's actually not too bad himself, who can fill in spots at the three. So I think Edwards is in really kind of a sketchy spot where he has this pressure to perform, especially given him reportedly not being too into basketball. So it'll be interesting to see how that'll fold out.
hmm
All right. So our next topic, improving players. Nate, who do you have as a fantasy player? Who do you think will improve a lot this year?
well, I'm gonna go for a guy who has been chosen by upset fantasy GMs for a long time because his production was supposed to go up in Deontay Murray. I think that Deontay Murray, the Spurs are moving in a new direction. At least they should be. The days of DeMar DeRozan should be over. LaMarcus Aldridge is a useful veteran to have on the team, but I think they really need to invest more into Deontay Murray, Derek White, and Lonnie Walker. But Deontay Murray's per 36 numbers last year, he per 36, which he should be playing at least 36 minutes this year.
Yeah.
He averaged 15.4 points, 8.2 boards, 5.8 assists. You're really looking at a guy who could evolve into a consistent triple double threat. A guy who will be won't be the greatest 3-point shooter, but he's got a really good all around game. He plays great defense. He should have been trusted more by Greg Popovich the last couple of years to play more than he has. But I really think this is the year where investing in Deontay Murray actually pays off. So I'm
Yeah.
looking at him as a mid to later round pick, but I think he'll be well worth it.
He he reminds me of a lot of SGA in terms of his potential. Like even you like saying his stats, like that's some Gilgeous Alexander numbers right there. And I think he has the potential to do that. And people forget he was on the all defensive second team back in 2018, right? And before his injury. So I think him having the IQ defensively and also offensively, I think that really helps in terms of his numbers. And it also hinges on how much Popovich goes to DeRozan for their offense. And it really also hinges on, are they going to contend? And from my perspective, I think they will, which means they might go to DeRozan a bit more. But yeah, there's a lot of what ifs and conditions for that. But I think Murray will be a very interesting pick.
Yeah, I think that he will really show his potential this year. I mean, this is the last year I'll advocate for him if he doesn't,
Yeah.
because we've been I've been thinking that he was a good choice for the last couple of years. So I don't know. I really see this as a year where he either reaches his potential or he becomes a bust. So
Yeah, and they also have other young point guards, so I think there's a lot of pressure on him because they got Keldon Johnson, Derek White. They just got Trey Jones, Lonnie Walker. So there's a lot of guards on that team, and for him to be in that position where he's probably going to start, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on him, especially when he's under Pop.
yeah, agreed.
Okay. For my improving player, I'm gonna go with Dylan Brooks from the Grizzlies. He averaged 20 points, 4 rebounds, 3 assists in the bubble. And as a Blazers fan, we watched him a lot when they played against Memphis. And this guy could get his own shot. And he's also got a really good motor in terms of how he plays in his energy during the game, because he goes all out. And just because Memphis is so thin coming into the season in terms of offense, they only got John Morant, Dylan Brooks, Valanciunas, Jackson Jr. is out still. So I think using Brooks as probably the number one, number two option on that team, I think he'll get a lot of offensive production and also defense in terms of rebounds. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I have issues with guys generally who are threes and don't have playmaking ability. I think you could see Dylan Brooks averaging a lot of points this year, but at the same time, I just don't see his value translating to much more than, I don't know, saying Andrew Wiggins. I think that Dylan Brooks as a player has nearly capped out on his potential
Interesting.
at this point. I mean, he's a good shooter, he can get to the basket, but John Morant's clearly the number one option this year. And with Jaren Jackson out, I think you'll see Valanciunas'
Yeah,
production
for
fly
sure.
through the roof. But I do have I do have issues with wings who don't have playmaking abilities. So I think he could be a good player, but for me, I just don't see huge
Yeah,
upside
I
there.
yeah, I actually, yeah, when I think about it, he's probably gonna be a guy who's gonna shoot like 8 for 20 most nights. But at the same time, I think he's a really good player. I watched him when he was in Oregon, and he just has that offensive potential and that motor, and that can probably translate into good fantasy value. But I don't know. It's tough to pick out improving players just because like they sucked last year maybe. And yeah, I don't know. But I think Brooks is somewhat of a good option.
hmm I had one more for improving players in
Sure.
their existing situations. I had Marvin Bagley. Marvin Bagley in his first year, later in the season, was a really good source of double doubles. I mean, he put up around like 17 and 10 a game. And I really think that the Kings have to commit to playing Marvin Bagley out of the fact that they drafted him over Luka Doncic. Um,
Yeah.
that one is going to live with them forever unless Bagley lives up to be at least a reasonable NBA starter. And, the center situation in Sacramento, I mean, they signed Hassan Whiteside maybe a week ago now. But I think that that organization is obligated to play Marvin Bagley 30 minutes a game. And when he has played 30 minutes a game, he's gotten you a double double with 18 points and 10 boards. So I
Yeah.
see him as a good option. Sacramento obviously losing some scoring with Bogdan leaving. But I think that between Buddy Hield and De'Aaron Fox and Marvin Bagley, that team still stays somewhat competitive. Not a playoff team, but competitive in the West. So I think he'll be playing a lot this year.
Interesting. I just because I drafted him last year and he went down with injuries, I don't really trust him. But I think you make a good point. And also, like, if you look at their starters for this year, you got Fox, Hield, Barnes, Bagley, and probably Whiteside. And I think they're probably gonna move Whiteside to the bench later on and start Bielitsa, which opens up even more rebounds for Bagley. So I think it'll be good to kind of bank on Bagley for this year.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I mean, Whiteside, it's unbelievable how a guy with that production got a contract worth $2.3 million, but I guess that's a modern NBA now. Um, he will have good numbers and it will come as a surprise, but I think he will be headed towards the bench eventually, just out of the fact that his game really caps out. So,
Yeah, and even they even have Rashawn Holmes too. and he played a lot of good minutes for them last year too. Just even watching him in fantasy, you're just seeing this guy put up like 15, 15,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, he
In like
did.
30 minutes.
He did play really well in our league last year for when he
Yeah.
wasn't injured.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting piece to that team because they got options at the forward, like in Bagley, Bielitsa, and Holmes in terms of how you want to play that out. So yeah, that'd be an interesting choice.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely could go bad, but I don't know. I just think out of the obligation of playing him because they selected him over Luca, he will have
Yeah,
to get minutes and production. So
yeah. I have I have one more player as well, and he's very interesting just because he's not going to be like an early round, maybe not even mid round. But if people are in like a super deep league and are looking for people, I think Tyler Hero is a very interesting guy. And the reason I say this is because Miami's roster is very is still deep this year. Like you got about 4 or 5 guards who could all start in Goran Dragic, Kendrick Nunn, Duncan Robinson, Tyler Hero, Avery Bradley. And so I think Hero and his potential really relies on how much Spo plays him. Because in the bubble, he averaged 16, 5, and 4, which is pretty good for a rookie, and everyone knows now how good he is, how much confidence he's got. And when I watched him play in the playoffs, he's got that kind of athletic bounce in terms of like grabbing a lot of open rebounds. And I think that's an opportunity where like easy rebounds for him, he's gonna grab those. And I think if they play him a lot this year, he'll be a very sneaky waiver pickup at times.
yeah, that's an interesting point because in his time in the bubble, I think this must have been later rounds of the playoffs, maybe the Eastern Conference Finals. I remember a game where he had like 13 boards, 11 assists, and
Yeah,
11 points. I was shocked when I saw that stat line. I figured he maybe gets like 2 boards a game, but he's a pretty good rebounding shooting guard. Like you could look for him to honestly average 6 or 7 a game this year. So
yeah. I'm just looking at his game log. In game one against Boston, he scores 12 points, 11 rebounds, 9 assists in 40 minutes,
y-
which is pretty insane
yeah,
for a guy like
it's
him.
really interesting to see a guy that most people would just write off as a pure scorer to go for that in a playoff game.
Yeah. What do you think about Miami's guard rotation? Like who do you think is gonna start for them? Like if you're gonna fill the point guard and shooting guard.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you look at that signing for Avery Bradley, and Avery Bradley, people will forget because he didn't come to the bubble, but at some points during last season, he was the third best player on the Lakers.
Yeah.
And I think the signing of him was a lot more out of talent than need for the Heat because you look at their guard rotation, like you were saying before, you have Dragic and Hero starting, and Duncan Robinson playing at the 3, and then you have Kendrick Nunn and Avery Bradley, who are guys. Kendrick Nunn was great when he was starting at the 3 when
Yeah.
Dragic was out, but I just think you have 2 guys there who are starting material, who are sitting on the bench, and I think that in some ways the Heat were trying to replace Jay Crowder with Avery Bradley, but Bradley's a 2 and Crowder's a 3. So
Yeah.
I think that they have to give Hero starting minutes still, or he could play the James Harden 6-man role, where you play 36 minutes
Yeah.
a night and
Exactly.
you are called a 6-man, even though you come in 2 minutes into the game. But
Yeah.
I think he is their best long-term prospect, apart from Bam. Bam is a great player too, but he is probably what you will look towards 5 years down the line as the best player in Miami. So, yeah, you're probably going to see a lot of minutes from him this year.
So so hypothetically if you have Jimmy Butler at the 3, Bam Adebayo at the 4, and Myers Leonard at the 5. Myers Leonard is a bit iffy, but let's just say he's at the 5.
Yeah, he
Who
got
would you
paid a
have?
lot of money.
Yeah, exactly. Who would you have at the 1 and 2 to start?
Well, you have to have Dragic at the one. Um, he's he's really the key to Bam having success. I think like his playmaking for Adebayo is really underrated. He finds Adebayo on the right spots, and you spent a lot of money to re-sign him this year. If you're mentioning that Butler will be playing at the three, I think you still have to take Hero off the bench because I think Robinson
Yeah.
has earned the role of starting two guard.
Robinson has to start.
Yeah, yeah, he
He
really
changes
does.
he really changes the entire defensive scheme of the other team just because he's such a threat, like
Yeah,
from three
yeah.
point
It's
line.
like if you look to the Clippers of 5 or 6 years ago now, like one of the most important pieces to that team was having JJ Redick out there
Yeah.
because JJ Redick could shoot the lights out. So you were
Even with the Sixers too,
you
back
were
in
yeah
2018.
yeah with the 76ers, yeah. That's why they were as successful as they were that year. If Toronto hadn't made that shot, who knows? But I think that with a guy like Robinson, you're always facing man to man defense because they can't sag off of him, and they're not going to sag off of Butler. And Adebayo can play well, and then your center is the only option who's left to double team, but you're not going to double team with a center. So I really think that Robinson does have to start. You'll probably see a lot of Jimmy Butler at the four. That's my prediction this year.
Interesting. I see it this way where Dragic comes off the bench just because he's getting old and he's had some injury problems. And I would go with Avery Bradley and Tyler Hero to start at the 1 and 2. And the reason I say this is because Butler has proven that he can play make. So I think you kind of run this like the Lakers where Braun is the point guard and you got two other guards who can defend and who can shoot. So I think if you go Bradley, Robinson, and Butler, Leonard Adebayo to start, I think that's probably your best option in terms of defensively too. You got Bradley, who's a way better defender than Dragic, and then you got, of course, here off the bench still. But I think that's to start the season, and I think the Heat will probably take out Leonard out of the rotation as the playoffs come, and you'd probably see Dragic, Robinson, Bradley, Butler, Adebayo, and go a bit smaller.
Yeah, yeah, I think there's a good chance of that too.
Yeah. So, yeah. So enough of the improving players. So our last topic today is regressing players. Nate, who do you have for those?
Um, Another player who I had last year who was incredible, but will probably see a big dip in production out of what that team has done in the offseason, and that's John Collins. John
Really?
Collins was a reliable source of 21 and 11 last year.
Yeah.
21, 11, and two blocks when they didn't have a center. And he was probably a top 20 player for most of last season. He can do a bit of everything. He can shoot the three. He's an outstanding dunker, and he can even shoot mid range and post up. But that team got a lot this offseason. I'm not gonna go on about how much I like the Atlanta roster because they might not even be a playoff team this year. But
Yeah.
I think that the additions of Capella, which they added last season at the trade deadline, who didn't play, Gallinari, who is a really good player. If you look at his stats from the last 2 years, you're looking at around like 20 and 5 a game, and Bogdanovich, who is a really crafty guard who can score a lot of points. And then you have a couple of bench additions and a new drafted center in Okongwu. And I just think what you're going to see is a dip in John Collins' points and rebounds to a degree where he's not going to be averaging a double double on the year, and you're probably looking at around 18 and 8, which is still a good player and should still go in the drafts, but shouldn't go in the top 4 rounds. Maybe you're looking at round 6 or 7. it really sucks because he's an incredible player who really could excel on some other teams, but I just think Atlanta has too many players at this point.
That's a very interesting take you got there. I'm going the other way where, because I've on my list of regressing players, I got Clint Capella, and and I go on the other way in terms of the Hawks discovering that they should play Collins more than Capella, and he's gonna get more minutes and usage, just because Capella's skill set is very limited, and you have Gallinari who could fill in the four when you bump Collins down to the five. And because of that, I think Collins is a way more athletic and agile player than Capella, and he has the same defensive instincts and skills that he has. Maybe not the length, but probably he has a better defensive switchability when it comes to the Hawks defense. And so I think Collins will get a lot of usage, and they'll soon to discover that Capella is not needed as much. But I don't know.
Yeah, well, as a guy who loves John Collins and just the way he plays, I mean, they lost a lot of games last year, but they were one of the most enjoyable teams to watch in the NBA because John Collins dunks and shoots well, and Trae Young pulls up from 35. But I do think that as a team who traded for Clint Capella last offseason, you have to give him a fair run at the center position. And maybe at the end of the season, you're looking at John Collins playing most of the minutes at center. But I think early in the season, you're looking at a lot of John Collins at the four and Clint Capella at the five, which you're not looking at a lot of available rebounds when Clint Capella's out there, who's averaged nearly 14 for the Rockets in 2 years prior to this. So
Yeah, the Hawks roster is very interesting, and they're one of those teams right now where you just can't tell what their crunch time roster will be, and what their what their crunch time lineup will be, and which lineup is going to get the most usage. Um, I'm thinking it's going to be Trae Young, either Rajon Rondo or Bogdan in terms of if he needs shooting or not. Gallinari, no, sorry, Hunter and Collins. I don't know. This is just so confusing in their lineup. But what do you think would be their most ideal lineup?
yeah, well, I'm sure this is a team that we'll be discussing more because I think this team is unbelievably versatile for what could be a bad team. Um, what's interesting is I question if having Trae Young on the floor for this team will be better or worse at times. I think you have a lot of dynamic scoring on this roster. You have Bogdanovich, who is a really impressive player. Gallinari, who shoots the lights out. Like, he shoots nearly 40% from three and 50 from the field. Like, he's a great shooter and he makes some tough shots. And Collins, who I could go on more about, but he's good at almost everything on the floor. He's an ideal four at this point. And then you have Capella. I think Rondo offers you a lot of maturity that Trae Young doesn't possess at this point. And I don't know. I think that Atlanta will play Trae Young the same amount of minutes this year. But I think it should be interesting to look at the on-off splits of Trae Young and how they actually affect the team this year. So
Yeah, because Bill Simmons said this. Trae Young's the worst defender in the league, and I totally agree with him.
yeah,
And having him on the floor, like defensively, I think it's always gonna hurt them. And I think when we talk about Capella and Collins, I think it's like if you run a pick and roll against Trae Young and John Collins / Clint Capella, I'd rather have John Collins on the floor just because he's a more switchable guy, and it can guard the perimeter better than Capella. So when you have that in mind, I think you would kick Capella out of the lineup and just putting Gallinari or like Cam Reddish or DeAndre Hunter, like whoever's hot that game or
Yeah,
whatever.
agreed. Look at the Boston Celtics as a team who could potentially trade for Clint Capella if things don't work out in Atlanta.
Yeah, yeah, they got no center. I think they would love a center for that.
So, who do you got on your list of players who will see dips in production?
So I had Capella. I think staying with the Celtics, I'm gonna go with Kemba Walker, just because of a bunch of things. Like first of all, his knee. He's not even 100% to coming into the season, and I had Walker 2 years ago, and I won our league, and he was great back when he was in Charlotte, and he's such a great player. Like he can get his own shot. He's fast. Like all the good stuff, right? But the reason I say he's gonna do bad is first, yeah, because of his injuries, and just because Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum are just too big enough of an offensive threat for Brad Stevens to ignore in his offensive scheme, and just because Walker's injuries are gonna limit him, um, it's not gonna be a good year for him this year. And even let's just say he's back 100% healthy. Sure, he's gonna play make, but you're going to want to give the ball to Jason Tatum if you're the Celtics. And in terms of where this team's going to go in the next few years, you got to give Tatum the reps.
Yeah, I agree. I think the big thing that stands between Jason Tatum and the upper echelon of top 10 players is that he doesn't really possess playmaking ability at this point. And that's something that the Boston Celtics are going to work on a lot this offseason, I think.
And they have Jeff Teague. So
Yeah.
playmaking's not too big of a problem for them if Walker's out.
Yeah, I think I'm going to see the ball in Tatum's hands a lot, especially if Kemba's not on the floor. I really like Kemba as a player. I think he's a good leader for a younger team. He's mature. I mean, he's shown over his career. If you look back at him in his college days, he can make big shots. And I do agree. Like watching him in the playoffs last year, at times it was like you're watching that Boston series, and
He couldn't shoot
Tatum
at all.
and Brown are really playing well, and Kemba's just kind of there for some of the games. Like
Exactly.
he was scoring like 10 points in some of those games, and as a guy who's been all NBA for a couple of years and has been an all-star for the last 4 or 5, yeah, I don't see him averaging his normal 20 and 6 or 7 a game this year. So
Yeah.
I think he's still a choice in the mid rounds. But yeah, I do see his production falling quite a bit this year. So
Yeah. Okay. I got one more player that we can talk about before we wrap up the podcast, and this is probably going to be a surprise to most people just because of how he did in the bubble, and that's Jamal Murray. And I know we've discussed this before, where we both don't think he's gonna play at the level that he played in the bubble, and what he did in the bubble was truly exceptional. But just because of the player and how I see him and probably how you see him, he's not going to be the same. No way. Sure, he might be sure like a fraction of what he was good or how good he was in the bubble, but he's not going to produce those superstar numbers you saw in the bubble. What are your thoughts?
yeah, I agree with you. I think some players are superstars when the pressure's on, and when you're in the playoffs, you see who the true stars on a team are. And I don't think that Jamal Murray's statistics this year will reflect that he is a star. I mean, I think Michael Porter Jr. is going to show better numbers this year, and you may say they lost Jeremy Grant, but they barely played Jeremy Grant during the regular season. But I just think that Jamal Murray is a guy who scores when he wants to, and he doesn't really care about being the man on a team, which it's strange to say, but some guys live for the moment. Like you look at a guy like Rondo, I mean, they're different players, but Rondo, year after year, he is not great in the regular season, and then he's incredible in the playoffs. And I think Jamal Murray will have slightly better numbers than last year, but he's not going to be a top 30 player, in my opinion, this year. He just doesn't offer you enough assists per game to meet that. I think his points will not be the same as they were in the bubbles.
Yeah, I think I would say this about him. From what you said about him playing good under pressure, just because the Nuggets are going to be worse this year because they lose Jeremy Grant, if they're in a tough spot where they need to get into the sixth seed and avoid the play-in, and where they're the last like 10 games of the regular season hinges on their playoff seeding, I think that's when Jamal Murray is gonna kind of pop off a little bit, and where he's gonna produce a bit more. And if you're a fantasy owner, I think a trade for him in the beginning of the season would be great, or sorry, mid-season, to get him for the last stretch of the season would be pretty impactful for me in terms of where that's going to go.
Yeah, agreed. One last question I have for you before we end this thing. Who is your first round or your first overall pick? I mean, a lot of people might struggle with this year, so I just want to get your take on that.
First of all, in our league, I might not have a first round pick because according to our guys in the league, they think I'm too powerful.
That is so absolutely true.
Because I finished in first last year, and I won the year before.
Although I would argue I had the best team going into the playoffs.
I totally exactly. I totally agree with that. That's why I'm a bit frustrated that they might take away my first round pick just because I knew I wasn't gonna do well last year, but if they give me the first round pick this year.
I think you're probably gonna get one. It may just be the last in the first round.
Yeah, but the obvious pick is Giannis, but and I told you this before, where I'm a bit iffy if I get the first overall pick, because I really want to take Doncic, just because he just gets triple doubles night in, night out.
Yeah, as the owner of Doncic with the 13th pick last year.
Yeah, you picked him really late.
Oh my goodness, he was
second
incredible.
round.
He was for the first part of the season. He was a triple double every night, and really with KP out, he is going to be the man on that team. He already was the man, but they're going to go to him more than ever, and he's just a really impressive player. Like, you look at his series versus the Clippers when they didn't have Porzingis and Paul George and Kawhi Leonard were all in him all game. Like, that man was still producing at a high rate. I honestly think that if you're picking this year, you should go with Luka Doncic as the number one overall pick.
I don't know if you're telling the truth to me here. I think you just want Giannis.
Well, I guess we'll see about that.
But okay, so let's say Giannis and Luka are picked 1-2, and you have the third pick. Who would you take?
With the third pick, I would look at a guy like I think LeBron was amazing last year, but I just think with his rest, you can't take him third overall this year. You know, I would look at a guy like Karl Anthony Towns. I mean, it's kind of a crap team, and they may not make the playoffs or even be in contention, but that dude puts up a lot of good numbers, and he doesn't have an injury history. Like, I think Embiid is a great player, but has a long injury history, and I really think that you're looking at Karl Anthony Towns as the top player again this year.
Did you forget about Jokic?
No, I didn't forget about Jokic.
So you wouldn't pick him, hey?
No, I wouldn't pick him. I don't know. He just perennially has a slow start to the season, and he picks it up later. But I just think when you're looking at nightly double-doubles with 25 and 15 and you want solid production, Towns will give you that. And who knows what the role of Porter Jr. will be on offense this year. It could be a lot.
Yeah.
So I think the safest pick is Karl Anthony Towns 3.
Yeah, I would say Jokic is just, he's such a high-risk player in the first round just because he can go in a game and finish with 9, 7, and 8 and not even, like, just be so close to a triple-double and just not get that threshold and just, like, underproduce for that night. So,
sure.
I don't know, but I think I would still go with Jokic in terms of the third, if at the third pick?
Oh, I guess you will have to see what happens with Harden. I mean, his
I don't know.
production could swing up and down this year, but
He could
I think
he
he's
could pout.
still a viable option at that spot as
He
well.
he could pout and not play until he gets traded.
Yeah,
That's the thing that concerns me about Harden.
a Le'Veon
Um,
Bell kind of situation.
yeah, even Anthony Davis situation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
agreed.
So, yeah. Any final thoughts before we wrap up this pod?
No, I would just like to say that I hope this was helpful for you guys during your fantasy drafts. If you're looking at which players to pick, which will be your late round steals, and if you have any other questions, feel free to send us an email, and we'll try and address them in the next episode.
Yeah, I'm excited for this fantasy season just because everyone's hating against me in our league. I think I could I think I could probably pull it off if they take away my first round pick. I can do it.
Hey,
I know I
last
can
year
do
I
it.
picked Steph Curry second, and I still had the best team. So, although that did have to do with a little help of the second best player in fantasy and Luka Doncic falling to me in the second round.
Very
So,
yeah, that kind of made up to you. Yeah, he made that up to you for that year.
for
Yeah, I don't know.
sure.
It's gonna be a fun year for sure, and especially with COVID and all that stuff. It's gonna be interesting to see which players are out for how long. Because
Yeah,
I think the waiver will be um very much used this year just because everyone's gonna go out with COVID. So
yeah, agreed.
yeah, I think that it's good that we made this pod in terms of going a bit deeper into late round or even waiver pickup players just because of the entire situation.
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully, some of these players will be available later in your drafts, and you can pick them up.
Yeah. So thanks for listening to our pod. I don't even know if you have a name for this, but I guess we'll figure that out later. And we're planning to do this weekly, so I don't even know what we're going to talk about next week, but it'll be fun though. I'm just super excited about the
Yeah,
NBA
we'll probably have
coming
a
soon.
primary focus on the NBA, but we'll touch on football and everything that comes around within the week of sports. So.
Yeah. All right. Until next time, we'll see you guys later.